All right, in this explainer, we're diving into what is honestly one of the most overlooked cover-ups in American history. We're looking at the systematic reclassification of indigenous peoples in the Southeast. Now, if you've ever dug into historical documents and just felt like, pieces were missing, or maybe family stories just didn't quite line up with the mainstream narrative, well, this explainer is going to connect a whole lot of dots for you. Because we're exploring how entire communities were essentially erased from the official record. And the craziest part, it wasn't by physical relocation. It was literally done with the stroke of a pen. Check out this provocative riddle from a 1928 issue of the Rhode Islander. The headline literally asks, "When is an Indian not an Indian? It's when he's a Negro." I mean, wow. That wasn't just some off-color joke. It was actually the key to a centuries-old bureaucratic strategy. It points back to a time when racial categories were incredibly fluid and, frankly, manipulated for very specific political and economic gains. It really forces us to ask ourselves, how deeply has our understanding of historical identity been shaped just by the labels that government officials decided to scribble down on paper?
Part 1. The First Encounters, Establishing the Baseline.
To really get this, we have to look at the timeline, because we actually have a totally unbroken baseline of eyewitness accounts here. Starting way back in 1492, Columbus explicitly described the indigenous people of the Caribbean as having cinnamon-colored skin. Skip ahead to 1528, and Spanish explorer Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca is writing about dark-skinned tribes walking freely in Florida and along the Gulf Coast. By 1591, Theodore de Bry is drawing Carolina Algonquians, showcasing broad noses, full lips, and dark skin tones. And even well into the colonial era, in 1758, Reverend Samuel Davies records his Indian congregants as having a dark complexion. So from 1492 all the way to the 1700s, early records consistently and explicitly document the original inhabitants of the Americas as dark-skinned, copper-colored people. And the visual evidence? It backs this up perfectly. When you look at Luis Churras's painting of a California mission, or the 1790 allegorical illustration of America, both show indigenous Americans with distinctively dark skin. This wasn't some weird anomaly. This was just the accepted, documented reality of what many Native American communities looked like at the time of early European contact. Actually, going back to Reverend Samuel Davies for a second, his 1758 observation is a massive piece of the puzzle. He specifically writes that his Indian congregants were of a dark complexion, not from mixture with Negroes, but by nature. He literally goes out of his way to clarify that. He's directly observing that these dark complexions were just inherent to the indigenous population, completely independent of any African ancestry. It was simply their natural appearance.
Part 2. The Paper Genocide, From Indian to Negro.
Okay, so by the early 1700s, colonial powers had a huge legal problem on their hands. They couldn't legally enslave indigenous people who had treaty rights, land rights, or visible tribal affiliations. So what was their workaround? It's a process researchers call paper genocide. Think of it as the bureaucratic erasure of entire bloodlines. Rather than fighting treaties in court, they just changed the labels on official documents. Suddenly, darker-skinned tribes in the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, and Alabama saw their racial categories swapped out. Indian was crossed out and replaced with terms like Negro, colored, or later on African American.
And this wasn't some backroom secret or clerical error. It was loud and clear public policy. Just look at this headline openly declaring that Virginia Indians may be classified with Negro race. Local laws and the U.S. Census actively lumped Native peoples and Africans into one single bucket. They were deliberately erasing tribal affiliations based purely on Eurocentric expectations of what an Indian was supposed to look like. If your skin was deemed too dark, boom, you are reclassified, regardless of your actual ancestry.
And as the Christian Science Monitor highlighted, this stripped away heritage generation by generation. It's so insidious because even the children of Native mothers, and remember, the mother's lineage traditionally defined tribal belonging, were officially recorded as Negro. This fundamentally erased their Creek or other Native heritage from the entire U.S. historical narrative. The people didn't vanish, right? Their official identities were just overwritten.
Part 3. A different removal. Surviving the aftermath.
Whenever we talk about Native American removal, the mind almost universally goes straight to the Trail of Tears, right? The forced march of the 5 civilized tribes out west to Oklahoma. But while that was happening, darker-skinned tribal members were facing a completely different, totally hidden kind of removal. Because they had already been legally reclassified as Negro on paper, they weren't allowed to migrate west. Instead, their removal meant forced racial erasure and enslavement. and they were kept right where they lived in the South.
For specific communities, the impact was just devastating. Members of the Creek, Yamasee, Gwali, and Tuscarora nations essentially became prisoners of war. They were held on plantations that were deliberately designed to break their identity, their culture, and their resistance. These were full-blood native people whose indigenous languages, names, and tribal affiliations were systematically stripped away in the official ledgers. They weren't relocated across the country, they were renamed and enslaved on their very own ancestral lands.
Part 4. Motives behind erasure. Why reclassify?
So why do this in the first place? Well, colonial powers essentially hit the jackpot with this strategy. It was a highly calculated move driven by 4 massive motives. First up, land theft. If a person is no longer officially an Indian, their treaty rights vanish, which opens up their land for the taking. Second is labor control. By changing their label to Negro, previously protected free people were legally transformed into property. Third, population control. Reclassifying kids suppressed tribal population counts, making it way harder for tribes to maintain federal recognition. And finally, historical erasure. By erasing the official Indians, it became a lot easier to push the narrative that the land was just empty and the cultures had mysteriously vanished.
And that leads to this incredible historical paradox. Look at this clipping. The historical records themselves openly acknowledged that the so-called Negro is not an African, he is an American. And it even points out that this demographic owned more than $1 billion worth of United States real estate. I mean, it shows that even back then there was this quiet, underlying recognition that many people classified as black were actually native to this land, and that tremendous economic power and land ownership were inextricably tied to this manipulated identity.
Part 5. Reclaiming a hidden legacy.
The modern day.
But here is the amazing part. Today, events like the 18th annual Black Indian Powwow are doing exactly what centuries of paperwork tried to prevent. They are reuniting tribal members. You have people from the Choctaw, Cherokee, Ponca, and other nations coming together. These are communities that were forcibly separated 180 years ago by these historical legal fictions and the Trail of Tears. They're gathering to celebrate shared culture, educate the public, and mend the broken branches of their family trees.
And it's not just about gatherings, right? It's about actually correcting the record. Modern genealogists have developed a specific, actionable 3-step process for descendants to uncover this buried truth. Step 1. Trace their ancestry through censuses, military records, and land deeds. Step 2. Pinpoint that exact moment where the family was reclassified on paper, thereby breaking the illusion. And Step 3. Use that hard documentation to apply for tribal citizenship. It's a rigorous process that proves a family's Indian heritage isn't just a myth passed down by a grandparent. It is a documentable reality.
So, to wrap up this explainer, I really want you to think about this. We often treat historical ledgers and census records as absolute objective truths. But as we've clearly seen today, those documents were often just tools, used to reshape reality for economic and political gain. So if centuries of paper genocide altered the official record, what hidden legacy might be waiting to be reclaimed in your own family tree? History is often hiding right there in plain sight on the ledger, just waiting for descendants to reclaim their true names. Thanks so much for joining me as we explored this incredible source material. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you on the next one.